No one voted for $45,000 of debt. No one signed a loan agreement. No one walked into a bank. And yet, every resident woke up owing it. $45,000 each. Children, retirees, workers, business owners, all buried under the same invisible number. This is the story of how one council quietly turned a town into a balance sheet. It didn't start with corruption. It started with optimism. The council had a vision. Revitalize the area, attract tourism, create jobs, modernize infrastructure. It sounded responsible, forward-thinking, necessary, because the town was struggling, shops closing, young people leaving, revenue shrinking. And shrinking revenue terrifies local governments, because governments run on cash flow, so the council proposed a solution: borrow now, grow later. Debt was framed as investment, strategic development, long-term growth, future-proofing the town. Those phrases calm people. Debt sounds dangerous, investment sounds smart. The council didn't raise taxes immediately. That would spark outrage. They borrowed instead. Millions, then more millions, for a new complex, an event center, infrastructure upgrades, consulting studies, urban redesign, each decision individually defensible, collectively massive. At first, nobody felt anything, because debt doesn't hurt when it's approved. It hurts when it's serviced. The projects took longer than expected. Costs exceeded projections. They always do. Construction delays, rising material prices, contract renegotiations. The original budget expanded quietly. But here's the key mistake. The revenue projections were optimistic, very optimistic. Tourism didn't surge. New businesses didn't flood in. Events didn't sell out. Income lagged. Debt did not. Loans have no patience. Interest compounds whether growth arrives or not. Soon, repayments began to bite. The council faced a choice: cut services or raise taxes. Neither wins elections. So they refinanced, extended terms, rolled debt forward, debt on top of debt. It felt manageable until it wasn't. Then came the audit. Numbers published publicly. Total liabilities divided by population. The math was brutal. Every resident effectively carried $45,000 of municipal debt, not personally signed, but structurally assigned, because municipal debt is communal. If the town can't pay, taxpayers will. The headlines hit hard. Town drowning in debt. Future generations saddled. People were shocked. They hadn't borrowed, but they were responsible. This is how public debt works. It socializes obligation. Now here's the deeper issue. Debt itself isn't always bad. Governments borrow constantly. The difference is productive return. If borrowed money generates more income than it costs, it stabilizes. If it underperforms, it strangles. In this town, projected growth didn't materialize, so servicing costs consumed operating budgets, maintenance budgets shrank, public services cut, infrastructure deferred, and taxes, they rose. Gradually, property taxes increased, business levies adjusted, service fees introduced, residents felt squeezed. But here's the painful irony. They weren't paying for current services. They were paying for past optimism. That's how debt traps municipalities. The people who approved it may be gone. The residents remain. Now imagine being a small business owner there. Margins already tight. Taxes rise. Foot traffic stagnates. You're funding projects that never delivered promised customers. That's where resentment grows. And here's the psychological weight. Residents feel betrayed. But technically, the council followed procedure. They voted. They approved budgets. They published plans. Everything legal. But legality doesn't equal sustainability. The $45,000 figure isn't a bill sent to each home. It's a structural burden. If population declines, debt per resident increases. If property values drop, tax revenue shrinks. Shrinking revenue makes repayment harder. Harder repayment leads to austerity. Austerity reduces attractiveness. Attractiveness declines population. Population decline raises per capita debt. That's the spiral. Debt isn't static. It interacts with demographics. And small towns are vulnerable. Now zoom out. This isn't just one council. It's a pattern. Local governments chasing growth with borrowed money, because stagnation is politically unacceptable. Growth wins elections. Debt delays consequences. Consequences often arrive later, sometimes much later. The residents in this town didn't wake up reckless. They woke up leveraged, through no direct action of their own. That's the power of communal finance. Public debt is invisible, until it's heavy. $45,000 per resident isn't just a number. It represents future taxes, reduced services, limited investment, economic rigidity. And rigidity is dangerous in uncertain economies. The council didn't intend disaster. They intended transformation. But transformation financed by optimistic projections can turn into obligation financed by taxpayers. And once debt crosses a certain threshold, flexibility disappears. Flexibility is survival. Without flexibility, even small shocks hurt deeply. a recession, a funding cut, a population drop. Each shock magnifies debt strain. That's the tragedy. The project that was meant to save the town became the anchor slowing it down. And here's the most uncomfortable truth. Every resident is now tied to that decision, even those who voted against it, even those too young to vote. Debt doesn't care about opinion, it cares about repayment. That's how one council buried every resident in $45,000 of debt. Not overnight, not with corruption, with optimism, with leverage, with the belief that growth would outpace borrowing. When growth slows and debt doesn't, the bill becomes generational. And generational bills don't feel democratic, they feel inevitable. When the $45,000 figure became public, people didn't panic immediately. They felt confused because no one had received a bill. No envelope, no due date, no direct demand. That's the thing about municipal debt. It doesn't knock, it seeps. At first, the impact showed up quietly. Library hours reduced, road repairs delayed, public events scaled back. Small cuts, manageable cuts, but cuts compound. And when services shrink, quality of life declines. When quality of life declines, property values soften. When property values soften, tax revenue shrinks. And when tax revenue shrinks, debt becomes heavier per resident. This is how leverage turns into a trap. Now let's break down what actually happened financially. The council borrowed heavily through long-term municipal bonds. Those bonds carried interest, not extreme interest, but enough. And interest doesn't negotiate, even if projects underperform, even if revenue falls short, even if tourism projections were wildly optimistic. Interest is owed every year, without exception. So when revenue from the new development came in below forecast, the budget gap widened. Instead of generating surplus to service debt, the project required subsidy. Subsidy means taking money from elsewhere. Elsewhere means essential services. The town wasn't bankrupt, but it was tight, very tight, and tight municipalities behave like tight households. They prioritize debt payments first, because default destroys reputation. And reputation matters in bond markets. If the town defaults, borrowing becomes more expensive. More expensive borrowing means even higher taxes later. So the council protected bondholders. Residents absorbed the adjustment. That's the hierarchy of public finance. Credit markets first. Citizens adjust. Now imagine you're a young family considering moving there. You research the town. You see rising taxes, shrinking services, debt headlines. You hesitate. Population growth slows. Slower population growth means less tax expansion. Less tax expansion means higher burden per resident. The spiral tightens. Here's the part nobody says during project announcements. Debt assumes growth. If growth doesn't arrive, debt becomes extraction. Extraction from existing residents, extraction over decades. That's the silent transformation. What began as investment becomes obligation, and obligation lasts longer than enthusiasm. Now let's talk about generational impact. Children in that town didn't vote, didn't approve budgets, didn't attend council meetings, but they inherit the environment. If tax rates rise to service debt, young earners pay more. If public services decline, opportunity shrinks. If infrastructure deteriorates, business investment slows, debt shifts future opportunity backward. And that's what makes $45,000 per resident so powerful. It's not about immediate bankruptcy. It's about constrained futures. Now imagine a recession hits, sales tax revenue drops, business activity slows, property transactions decline, debt payments remain constant. Constant obligations in declining revenue environments create pressure. Pressure forces austerity. Austerity reduces spending. Reduced spending slows local economic activity. Slower activity reduces revenue further. This is how municipal debt amplifies economic cycles. In good times, it feels manageable. In bad times, it feels suffocating. Now let's talk about political psychology. The original council members may have believed in the vision. Many probably did. Growth was the goal. Stagnation looked worse. But incentives matter. Politicians operate on election cycles. Debt operates on multi-decade timelines. When timelines mismatch, risk increases. A project that looks transformative in 5 years may become burdensome in 15. But the 15-year consequences don't affect short-term approval. So borrowing becomes attractive, especially when interest rates seem reasonable, especially when consultants provide optimistic forecasts. Forecasts are often based on best-case scenarios. Best case rarely becomes base case. But once borrowing begins, momentum builds. Stopping midway feels like failure. Continuing feels hopeful. Hope is powerful. Debt compounds quietly beneath hope. Now here's something even deeper. Municipal debt is often justified by comparison. Now, other towns are investing. We can't fall behind. We must compete. Competition encourages risk-taking. If neighboring towns build new facilities, you feel pressure to build bigger ones. Arms race thinking enters public finance. But arms races are expensive, especially when population growth doesn't support them. The $45,000 per resident number wasn't designed to scare. It was arithmetic. Total liabilities divided by residents. And that's what makes it brutal. It converts abstract borrowing into personal burden. Even though residents don't receive individual bills, they pay through higher taxes, higher fees, reduced services, delayed infrastructure. Every adjustment feels small. Collectively, they reshape daily life. Now imagine living there for 20 years. You pay increased taxes annually, you absorb service reductions, you watch political promises reset every election. But the debt remains. Debt doesn't campaign, debt persists. And that persistence changes community psychology. People become cautious. Businesses hesitate to expand. Young professionals leave for lower tax regions. Demographic shifts amplify strain. Fewer residents. Same debt. Higher per capita burden. And here's the final uncomfortable truth. No villain needed, no scandal required, just optimistic projections, leverage, and time. Time exposes structural weakness. When growth assumptions fail, the cost doesn't disappear. It transfers. That's how one council buried every resident in $45,000 of debt. Not through corruption, through confidence, not through theft, through leverage. And leverage is neutral until it isn't. Because leverage magnifies outcomes. If growth exceeds expectations, debt feels genius. If growth disappoints, debt feels reckless. In this case, growth disappointed. And disappointment doesn't refinance itself. Residents are left navigating a system tighter than before. The town still exists, still functions, but flexibility is gone. And flexibility is survival in uncertain economies. When flexibility disappears, even small problems feel large. That's the real cost of public debt, not headlines, not outrage. Constraint, long-term constraint. And constraint shapes generations. Years pass. The council members who approved the borrowing are no longer in office. Some retired, some moved on, some still defend the vision, but the debt remains. Because debt doesn't rotate out with elections, it anchors. And here's the part most residents slowly realize. They're not just paying interest, they're paying for lost optionality. When the town wants to build something new, a school upgrade, a hospital wing, a new transport link, there's less room. Because existing debt payments sit at the top of the budget. Debt service comes before ambition, before innovation, before expansion. That's the hidden cost, past borrowing taxes, future creativity. Now imagine the town wants to attract a new employer. The company asks about tax stability, about infrastructure investment, about long-term municipal strength. High debt ratios make lenders nervous. They make investors cautious. They make businesses hesitant, because debt reduces flexibility. Flexibility is what attracts opportunity. Without it, towns compete from weakness. Now here's the financial mechanism nobody talks about publicly. Municipal debt is often structured over decades, 20 years, 30 years, sometimes longer. That means residents pay for projects long after the political enthusiasm fades. Children born after the ribbon cutting still service the bonds. They never attended the grand opening. But they fund the interest. That's intergenerational leverage. And when leverage works, it feels visionary. When it fails, it feels unfair. Now let's examine how it quietly tightens. As debt service consumes more of the operating budget, maintenance gets deferred. Deferred maintenance compounds. Roads degrade faster. Facilities age quicker. Public assets lose efficiency. Deferred maintenance today becomes emergency spending tomorrow. Emergency spending often requires more borrowing. More borrowing increases debt ratios. Ratios increase interest costs. Interest costs squeeze budgets further. It's not dramatic, it's incremental. And incremental pressure is harder to fight than collapse. Now consider the residents psychologically. At first, they're frustrated. Later, they're resigned. Because reversing municipal debt is slow. You can't simply pay it off overnight. Taxes rise slowly. Services adjust gradually. Growth may or may not recover, so people adapt. But adaptation isn't prosperity, it's survival. Now here's the uncomfortable global parallel. This pattern isn't unique to one town. Across regions, councils and municipalities borrow for growth. Sports arenas, convention centers, luxury developments, infrastructure expansions. Sometimes it works. Sometimes projections overestimate demand. When projections fail, residents fund optimism retroactively. And because the math is complex, most citizens don't fully grasp it until it's too late. Debt disclosures sit in long PDF reports. Bond covenants hide in technical documents. Public meetings occur at inconvenient times. Transparency exists, technically, but comprehension is rare. And without comprehension, accountability weakens. Now imagine a demographic shift. Young people leave for larger cities. Retirees remain. Tax base shrinks. Debt per resident rises automatically, because total debt doesn't shrink with population. That's the arithmetic trap. Population decline magnifies per capita burden. Per capita burden influences migration decisions. Migration influences tax base. Tax base influences repayment ability. It's a loop. Now here's the most brutal truth. Debt transforms time into obligation. Instead of planning for opportunity, the town plans around repayment. Instead of asking, what could we build? They ask, what can we afford after servicing debt? That mental shift changes culture. Ambition narrows. Risk tolerance falls. Every new proposal is filtered through one question. How does this affect our debt ratio? Debt becomes the central character in policy. Not growth, not innovation, debt. And when debt becomes central, residents feel stuck. Not bankrupt, not collapsed, just constrained. Constraint is quieter than crisis, but over decades, constraint reshapes opportunity. Now, let's finish where we started. $45,000 per resident. It wasn't a personal loan. It was a communal gamble, a bet that growth would outrun borrowing. When growth fell short, the bet didn't disappear. It matured, with interest. And that's the lesson. Public debt isn't evil. It's leverage. Leverage magnifies outcomes. When leaders borrow, they're borrowing against the future. If the future delivers, residents benefit. If it doesn't, residents absorb. In this case, residents absorbed, not in one dramatic collapse, but in rising taxes, in shrinking services, in slower progress, in fewer options. And the most painful part? Most of them never voted for $45,000 personally, but they live inside it daily. That's how one council buried every resident in $45,000 of debt, not through scandal, not through crime, through optimism financed by leverage. And leverage always demands an outcome. If the outcome fails to arrive, the bill never forgets.